The ordinary beginning, the evening lights of the small school were dim. The hallways almost empty, and the sound of footsteps echoed softly against the tiles in one corner. A woman in a faded uniform pushed her mop across the floor, her movements slow but steady. She had been working since early morning and still had hours to go before she could rest. Her daughter sat quietly on a wooden bench near the hall, her hands folded in her lap, watching her mother with wide, thoughtful eyes. She had been waiting there many times before. It was routine for her, while other children went home to warm meals and cozy beds. She stayed behind in the quiet halls of the school, her only company, the faint smell of polish and the sound of brushes sweeping against the floor. At the far end of the hall stood a grand piano, its black surface shining faintly, even in the dim light. It looked untouched, too elegant for the plain wooden stage where it sat. Every time the girl waited for her mother, her eyes wandered to that piano. Something about it pulled her like a secret whisper. She had never dared to sit on its stool, never dared to let her hands touch the keys. Yet in her heart, she imagined the sound. She imagined herself sitting there, filling the air with music. The girl often heard students practicing after school, their fingers moving with confidence, guided by trained teachers. She sat silently in the back, pretending to read a book, but her ears never missed a note. She watched how their hands flowed like water over the keys, how they leaned forward when the music grew soft, and how their faces changed when the sound grew strong. Something inside her memorized it all, like a quiet fire building. But when the last student left and the teacher closed the door, the hall would go silent again. Her mother never noticed the way she stared at the piano. Or maybe she did, but chose not to say anything. The cleaner was tired most of the time, her back stiff, her arms sore from scrubbing. Yet she always smiled at her daughter and told her that one day life would be different. The girl carried those words like treasure, though she never asked how life could change. Not when her mother worked so hard, not when their home was small and simple. She knew music lessons cost money, and money was always short, so she made her own way. At home, she had drawn piano keys on a piece of cardboard and placed it on the kitchen table every evening after homework. She tapped her fingers over the fake keys, whispering notes to herself. It looked strange to anyone else, but to her, it was real. Sometimes she even closed her eyes and imagined herself on stage. She imagined people listening, their faces calm, their hearts touched by the sound of her music. But then the dream would break, and she would return to the silence of their small kitchen, her mother washing dishes with tired hands. One winter evening, as the wind outside howled and the school felt colder than usual, the girl wrapped her arms around herself on the bench. Her mother was busy mopping the far hallway, and the sound of water sloshing in the bucket echoed across the empty space. The girl's gaze once again landed on the grand piano. The hall was quiet, almost too quiet, and the shine of the piano seemed brighter than ever. Her heart beat faster. A thought whispered in her mind, what if she touched it, just once? No one would know. She looked at her mother. She's still far away. Her back turned. The girl slowly slid off the bench, her small shoes tapping against the floor as she walked across the wide hall. Every step felt heavy, like she was carrying a secret that could break. When she reached the stage, she hesitated, staring at the instrument, her fingers trembling slightly. She could almost hear the echo of the students who played there, their music still alive in the air. With a deep breath, she climbed the small steps and sat on the piano stool. Her legs barely reached the ground, and the keys stretched before her like endless possibilities. She raised one hand and gently pressed a single key. The sound that came was soft but full. It floated through the empty hall and made her heart jump. She pressed another, then another, and soon the notes began to form a fragile melody, a melody she had practiced countless times. On cardboard keys, it wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was alive. For the first time, her dream was not silent. It had sound. Her hands moved faster, not with skill, but with passion. Each note carrying the weight of her longing. The hall was still empty, or so she thought. But behind the door, someone had stopped to listen. Frozen in surprise at the sound, coming from the cleaner's daughter. The silent dream, the sound of the piano still lingered in the hall. Soft and fragile, like a secret that had escaped into the air. The girl's fingers trembled on the keys. She felt both excited and afraid. Because every note she played was something she had only imagined until now. For months, she had tapped on cardboard keys in her small kitchen, her mother watching with tired eyes, smiling faintly, never saying much. Now, the real sound filled her ears. And it was more beautiful than she had ever dreamed. She leaned forward, pressing another key. Then another, her little body swaying with the rhythm she felt inside. Her heart raced, yet it wasn't from fear. It was from joy, the kind of joy that warmed her chest and made her forget the cold air of the empty school. She did not notice that the music teacher had stopped by the door, holding a stack of papers, his face frozen in surprise. He had heard many students play, some trained, for years. But this sound was different. It was unpolished, but it carried something rare: emotion. The girl kept playing, unaware, her notes rising and falling, uneven yet filled with life, for her. The piano wasn't just an instrument, it was a voice. A way to speak the things she couldn't put into words. At that moment, she wasn't the cleaner's daughter. She wasn't the girl waiting alone in the cold hallways. She was a musician, even if only for herself. When her mother's footsteps grew closer, she quickly stopped, pulling her hands back in panic. She slid off the stool and hurried back to the bench. Her small shoes tapping the wooden floor, her cheeks burned with guilt. As if she had stolen something, the piano sat there. Quiet again, but it seemed to hold her secret. Her mother walked in, pushing the bucket along. Glancing at her daughter, who now sat very still, she said nothing, only nodded at her to be patient a little longer while she finished her work. The girl hugged her knees, her eyes drifting back to the piano, her mind still echoing with the sound she had created. That night at home, she couldn't sleep. The image of the piano keys flashed in her mind again and again. Her fingers moved under the blanket as if pressing invisible notes. She whispered soft sounds to herself, matching the movements, practicing even in the dark. The next day at school, she sat quietly as other students played in music class. Her eyes followed every motion, every detail, storing them in her memory. She noticed how some pressed the keys too hard, while others barely touched them. She noticed when they leaned in, when they closed their eyes, when they smiled. Every piece of detail she held inside like a treasure chest. No one knew how much she was learning, not from books, not from lessons, but from watching and listening. When her classmates left, she often lingered, pretending to wait for her mother. But really, she was listening to the faint echoes left in the room. Music was teaching her, even when no one else was at home. Her cardboard piano grew worn, the paper edges curling, the black lines fading from her constant practice. Still, she treated it as carefully as if it were made of gold. Every evening, she traced each key with her fingers, her lips moving with silent notes. Her mother sometimes paused while washing dishes, listening to the faint whisper of her daughter's music. Though no real sound came, a gentle sadness filled her, yet also pride. Because she knew her daughter's heart carried something special, the girl began to dream more. In her dreams, she saw herself standing on a stage, the lights warm on her face, a real piano under her fingers. She imagined the audience silent, waiting, then gasping at the first sound she created. She imagined applause, not for who she was, but for the music itself. Those dreams stayed with her, even when she woke up, driving her to practice harder. Even if her instrument was only cardboard, weeks passed and her secret desire grew stronger. She often stared at the piano in the empty hall, her fingers itching to touch it again, but fear held her back. What if she was caught? What if someone said she had no right? Still, her heart argued with her mind, whispering that music belonged to anyone who loved it enough. One evening, when the school was almost silent, she found herself walking toward the piano again. Her mother was busy with the classrooms, the sound of scrubbing far away. The girl's small hands rested on the keys once more, and she pressed down gently. The sound filled the air, not just notes this time, but the beginning of a song she had imagined for weeks. It was broken, uneven, but it was hers, and once again, she did not know. Someone was listening. The teacher had returned, standing in the shadow of the door, his papers forgotten. He realized then that the cleaner's daughter had a gift that could not be ignored. The girl, unaware of his presence, played on, pouring her heart into the keys, and with every note, her silent dream was slowly becoming something more. The forbidden try. The next afternoon, the school was quiet again. The hall's almost empty. Only the sound of a mop swishing against the tiles in the far corridor. The girl sat on the bench, her small hands folded tightly, her eyes locked on the grand piano at the end of the hall. It was like a silent invitation, waiting for her, daring her to come closer. Her heart beat faster as she thought about the moment she had touched the keys before. How the sound had filled the empty space like magic. She looked toward her mother, who was busy in another room, the door half closed, the faint scrape of a broom echoing from inside. The girl stood slowly, her steps careful. Like each one might betray her, the wooden floor creaked under her shoes as she crossed the hall, climbing the small steps to the stage. Her breath caught when she sat on the stool, her feet dangling above the ground, the piano before her like a secret world only she could enter. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Trembling, she pressed one, then another, and the notes drifted through the hall, soft at first, then stronger. She closed her eyes and let her hands move the way they had moved on cardboard at home, tapping out the melody she had practiced in silence for so long. This time the sound was real, the notes alive, and she felt as if her heart itself was speaking through the piano. But her joy carried a shadow. What if someone walked in? What if she was scolded? What if they told her never to touch the piano again? The thought made her hands shake, but the longing inside was stronger. She could not stop. Every key she pressed reminded her of who she wanted to be, not just the daughter of a cleaner, but someone who could make music, someone who could be heard. What she did not know was that she was no longer alone. The music teacher had returned for a forgotten folder, and once again he stopped outside the hall. He did not announce himself. He did not step forward. He simply stood still, listening. The girl's playing was clumsy in places, but it carried something rare, each mistake softened by the pure feeling behind the sound. The teacher felt a quiet shock rising in him. This child had no lessons, no training, yet she was shaping music out of nothing but her heart. The girl's hands grew bolder, pressing faster, exploring keys she had never dared to touch. She was no longer copying what she had seen. She was creating, inventing her own little song. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was alive. She leaned closer, swaying with the rhythm, her face lit by something stronger than fear. Then a sound startled her, the soft creak of the hall door. Her fingers froze on the keys. The melody cut off like a breath held too long. Her head snapped toward the sound, and she saw a shadow move. Her heart pounded. Had she been caught, would someone shout at her, tell her to stop? But the doorway was empty again, the silence heavy. She waited, her chest tight, but no one came. Forward, still trembling, she slid off the stool and hurried back to the bench. Her steps too quick, her face hot with guilt. The piano sat there in silence, as if nothing had happened. But she knew the air still carried her secret. Her mother returned a few minutes later, wiping sweat from her brow, and gave her a tired smile. The girl tried to smile back, but her mind was racing. She wondered if someone had seen her, if the piano would be locked now. She kept quiet, hugging her knees again. But her ears still rang with the sound of her unfinished song. That night, at home, she replayed the moment again and again in her head. She remembered the way the notes had filled the air, how free she had felt, and how quickly it had ended with that creak of the door. Was it her imagination, or had someone really been there? She whispered to herself that maybe it was just the wind, but deep down, she knew. The next day, she returned to the bench again, her eyes glued to the piano, her hands itched to touch it. But fear now mixed with her longing. What if she risked too much? What if the chance was taken from her forever? Yet, the thought of never playing again felt heavier than the fear. She knew her mother was proud of her cardboard practice, though she never said much. She also knew her mother worked too hard, too. Even dream about lessons. The girl decided she had no choice. She would have to keep trying, even if it meant stealing moments in silence. Because the piano was no longer just an instrument to her. It was her voice, and she could not bear to lose it. And while she sat there, pretending to wait patiently, she had no idea that someone else was already waiting too. The teacher had noticed. The secret was no longer hers alone. The forbidden try had opened a door she could not close. And soon, everything in her quiet world was going to change. The secret encouragement the following evening felt colder than usual. The school lights flickered in the empty hall, and the air carried a quiet stillness. The girl sat on the wooden bench, her hands fidgeting in her lap, her eyes once again drawn to the grand piano. Her heart ached to play, but the memory of the door creaking still made her hesitate. What if someone had seen her? What if the chance was gone? She glanced toward her mother, who was bent over her work. Scrubbing the floor of a nearby classroom, her mother hummed softly under her breath, a sound of weariness more than joy. And the girl felt a tug inside. She wanted to be brave. Not just for herself, but for the woman who worked so hard every day. Slowly, she rose from the bench and crossed the hall, her shoes tapping lightly on the wood, her small frame climbing the steps to the stage. Her hands touched the keys, one by one, soft notes filling the empty air again. She closed her eyes and let the sound carry her away. She played the simple melody she had practiced on cardboard, the one she whispered at night in the dark. This time she played longer, her fingers moving with more courage, as if the piano itself welcomed her back. But just as the music grew stronger, a voice spoke from the doorway. Gentle but firm. You play with feeling. Her hands froze instantly, the keys ringing with the sudden stop. Her head snapped toward the door, and her breath caught. There, in the dim light, stood the music teacher, holding a folder under his arm. His eyes fixed on her, she slid off the stool in panic, her face pale, her heart pounding as though she had been caught stealing. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though her voice was barely more than a breath. She stepped back, gripping her skirt, afraid of what he might say, afraid he would tell her she was never allowed near the piano again. But the teacher did not scold her. He walked closer, his steps slow, his eyes thoughtful. "You play with feeling," he repeated softly, "and that is something no lesson can teach." The girl blinked, uncertain if she had heard him right. He placed the folder on the piano and looked at her hands, small and trembling. "Where did you learn that?" he asked gently. She looked down, embarrassed. "At home," she murmured. "On paper, just drawings, no sound." The teacher's eyes widened, surprise flickering across his face. He had seen many children sit at this piano. Children with teachers, with lessons, with years of practice, but none of them had played with the raw emotion he had just heard. "You've been teaching yourself," he said, almost to himself. Shaking his head in quiet disbelief, the girl only nodded, afraid to say more. For a moment there was silence between them, the kind of silence that holds weight. Then the teacher slowly opened his folder and pulled out a worn sheet of music. The corners bent, the ink faded. He placed it gently on the piano stand. "Here," he said softly. "Try this." Her eyes widened. She stared at the sheet as though it were forbidden. "Treasure." "I can't," she whispered, shaking her head. "I don't know how." But the teacher smiled faintly. "You already know more than you think. Just follow the notes. Trust your ears. Trust your heart." Hesitant, the girl sat down again, her small hands hovering over the keys. She pressed the first note, then the next. Slowly stumbling through the unfamiliar shapes, her eyes darted from the paper to the keys. Her movements unsure, yet the sound began to form. It was broken, clumsy, but alive. The teacher stood beside her, not correcting, not judging, simply listening when she finally stopped. Breathless and nervous, he nodded. "You see," he said. Softly, "Music isn't about perfect hands. It's about a voice, and you already have one." Her chest tightened with something she had never felt before. Hope. The teacher gathered his folder again. "Come back tomorrow, after the halls are empty. I'll leave something here for you." Before she could answer, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving her staring after him, her heart racing with disbelief. Did he mean it? Did he really see something in her? She looked at the sheet music still resting on the stand, the faded notes glowing in the dim light like a secret gift. That night at home, she could barely sleep. She traced the air with her fingers, whispering the new melody she had stumbled through, her lips curling into a small smile. Her mother noticed. Asking gently why she looked so alive, the girl shook her head and only said, "I played, Mama. I really played." Her mother's tired eyes filled with quiet tears, though she hid them quickly. She knew the world was often cruel to children like hers, children without money or names that carried weight. But maybe, just maybe, the music inside her daughter could not be silenced. The next day, as the hall grew empty again, the girl's heart pounded with both fear and excitement. She walked toward the piano, knowing that this time she wasn't sneaking, she wasn't stealing a moment. This time, someone had given her permission. Someone had noticed. Someone had believed. And that changed everything. The first break the next few evenings became different. The girl no longer sat still on the bench with only longing in her heart. Now she had something real to look forward to. When the last student left and the halls grew quiet, she hurried to the piano, her little hands trembling with both fear and joy. There, waiting on the stand, would be a sheet of music left by the teacher just as he promised. Its corners bent, its lines faded. Yet to her, it was more precious than gold. She would sit down and press the keys one by one, stumbling at first, her fingers unsure, her eyes darting between the notes and the piano. But with every try, her movements grew steadier, her confidence deeper. The empty hall that once felt cold and silent now echoed with her music, rough at times, uneven but full of life. For the first time, the piano was no longer just a dream. It was her world. Her mother began to notice, though she never interrupted one evening. As she pushed her broom across the far hallway, she paused by the doorway of the hall. Her eyes filled with quiet tears as she watched her daughter sitting tall on the stool, the piano alive under her small hands. She had never seen her so alive, so full of fire. And though she feared the world might break her daughter's heart, she could not bring herself to stop her. Instead, she stood there in silence, clutching the broom tightly, and whispered a prayer that somehow life would make room for this dream. The girl did not know her mother was watching. She only felt the rush of music. Each day she grew bolder, testing more notes, trying to follow the sheets, sometimes failing, Sometimes surprising herself, she made mistakes. Yet instead of stopping, she laughed softly and tried again. The piano became her teacher, correcting her through sound and touch. Every wrong note pushed her to listen harder. Every right note lifted her higher. Days turned into weeks. And slowly her cardboard piano at home began to gather dust. She no longer needed to pretend with paper keys. Now she had the real thing. Yet at night, she still traced the air with her fingers under the blanket, whispering melodies as she drifted to sleep. Her dreams were brighter, filled with images of shining lights and a hall filled with people listening to her. The stage in her dreams no longer felt unreachable. It felt like something waiting for her. One evening, the teacher stepped inside quietly while she played. She froze in panic, but he raised his hand gently. "Keep going," he said softly, and she obeyed. Her fingers moved again, clumsy but determined. And the teacher stood there, nodding, when she finished. He leaned closer, pointing at the notes, showing her where she had slipped. He didn't scold, he guided. His words simple, his voice calm, for the girl. It was the first time anyone had spoken to her like a student. Like she belonged. After that, he would sometimes stay a little longer, giving her small hints, teaching her how to listen, how to let her fingers breathe between notes. It wasn't formal, it wasn't official, but to her, it was everything. She felt her world growing, note by note, song by song. Her heart swelled with gratitude, though she didn't have the words to say it. Her mother noticed the change too, not just in her playing, but in her spirit at home. The girl hummed while helping with chores, her eyes brighter, her steps lighter. Even when the nights were cold and the meals were simple, she carried a glow that warmed their small home. The mother often sat by the window after work, looking at her daughter and wondering how something so fragile could carry such strength. Still, doubts sometimes crept into the mother's heart. What if this was only a passing kindness? What if the world reminded her daughter of her place? She knew how people could be, how they looked at her with pity or dismissal because she wore a cleaner's uniform. Would they look at her daughter the same way, even if she played beautifully? She swallowed those fears and chose silence because she could not bear to dim her daughter's light. One late evening, as the girl practiced alone, she finished a piece and sat still, her hands resting on the keys. The hall echoed with the last fading note. She turned and saw her mother standing quietly in the doorway, tears glistening in her tired eyes. The girl's face burned with embarrassment, but her mother only smiled softly. Nodding, "Keep playing," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't stop." The girl's chest tightened, her throat ached with emotion. She nodded, and with trembling hands, she began again. This time, not just for herself, but for her mother. The music filled the hall, simple and imperfect, but strong with love. Her mother leaned on the doorframe, her heart swelling with both pride and fear. Pride that her daughter carried such beauty inside her, and fear of how the world might treat that beauty. But that night, as they walked home together under the dim streetlights, the girl humming softly, the mother carrying her cleaning bag, something had changed. The piano was no longer just a secret, no longer just a dream. It was becoming a part of their lives, a fragile hope slowly taking shape. And though the road ahead was uncertain, both mother and daughter felt it in their hearts. This was only the beginning. The big chance. The weeks passed quietly, and each evening the girl returned to the piano, her fingers stronger, her confidence slowly building. Her mother continued her cleaning work, sweeping and scrubbing while sneaking small glances toward her daughter. The teacher often left faded sheets of music on the stand, sometimes waiting a little longer to guide her, sometimes simply listening in silence. The hall that once echoed with emptiness now carried the heartbeat of a secret dream. Then one morning, a notice appeared on the board in the main hallway. The school was preparing for its annual talent showcase, a night where students performed music, dance, or drama on the stage. It was a tradition. Parents filling the seats, teachers clapping proudly, and students shining in their own small ways. The girl walked past the notice slowly, her heart skipping. She read the bold letters again and again, her fingers twitching at her side. For a moment, she imagined herself on that stage, the grand piano before her, the crowd waiting in silence. But the thought frightened her. She shook her head quickly and walked away. That evening, while she practiced alone in the hall, the teacher stepped forward after listening for a while. "You know," he said softly, "the showcase is coming. You could play." Her hands froze on the keys, her breath caught. She stared at him in disbelief. "No," she whispered quickly, shaking her head. "I can't. I'm not good enough. I'm not like them." The teacher's eyes softened. "You don't need to be like them. You only need to be you." But fear weighed heavier than hope. The girl lowered her gaze, her chest tight. The thought of standing in front of so many people made her stomach twist. She imagined the whispers, the stares, the laughter, the cleaner's daughter on stage. Trying to play, the teacher said nothing more. Only placed another sheet on the stand, but his eyes carried a quiet challenge. "Think about it," he said gently before leaving. At home that night, she was restless. She tossed in bed, her fingers twitching against the blanket as though pressing invisible keys. Her mother noticed her silence and asked softly what troubled her. The girl hesitated before whispering, "There's a showcase. The teacher said I could play." Her mother paused, the sponge in her hand dripping water into the sink. She turned slowly, her tired eyes searching her daughter's face. "And what did you tell him?" she asked. The girl's voice was small. "I said no, I can't. Mama, I'll fail." Her mother set the sponge down and walked over. Kneeling beside her, she cupped her daughter's face gently, her rough hands warm. "You are already playing," she whispered, "every night in that hall. Every note you play, you are living your dream. Why hide it? Why be afraid?" Tears filled the girl's eyes. "Because people will laugh," she said, her voice breaking. Her mother shook her head slowly. "Let them laugh. Music is not for them. It is for you." The words sank deep into her heart. And the next day, though her hands trembled, she whispered to the teacher, "I'll try." The teacher's eyes lit with quiet pride. He nodded. "Good. That's all you need to do. Try." The weeks before the showcase became different. The girl practiced harder, her fingers aching, her mind racing with fear and hope. Her mother often stayed late, waiting patiently in the shadows. Watching her daughter pour herself into the piano, the teacher guided her carefully, not pushing too hard, reminding her to feel the music instead of chasing perfection. The night of the showcase arrived quickly. The school hall was decorated with lights. Chairs lined in neat rows, parents filling the seats with chatter and laughter. Students stood backstage, some in costumes, some with instruments, nervously waiting for their turn. The girl stood among them, her small body shaking, her hands clammy. She could hardly breathe. She looked out from behind the curtain, seeing the crowd, and panic rose in her chest. Her mother found her backstage and knelt quickly, holding her hands tightly. "Don't play for them," she whispered firmly. "Play for yourself. Play for me. Play because the music is inside you and it needs to come out." The girl's lips trembled, her eyes wide, but she nodded slowly. Clutching her mother's hands before stepping back, one by one, students performed. A dancer twirled, a singer sang softly, a violin filled the hall. Then the announcer called her name. The words echoing through the hall, whispers rose in the audience, some curious, some surprised, "The cleaner's daughter." The girl stepped onto the stage, her legs trembling, the lights blinding, her heart pounding so hard it felt like the whole hall could hear it. She sat at the grand piano, her hands shaking above the keys. For a moment, the whispers of doubt returned. "They will laugh. They will not care. You do not belong here. But then she remembered her mother's voice, soft and strong. Play for yourself. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and pressed the first key. The note rang clear. She pressed another and another. The melody beginning to flow, shaky at first, then steadier. Her body swayed with the rhythm, her fingers moving as though they had waited their whole life for this. The hall grew silent, the whispers fading into stillness, all eyes on her. The music carried through the air, simple, pure, full of heart. For the girl, the crowd disappeared, the stage disappeared, even fear disappeared. There was only her, the piano, and the sound that rose between them, and for the first time she felt she truly belonged. The performance, the first note, hung in the air, soft and trembling. Yet it carried across the hall like a whisper everyone leaned in to hear. The girl's fingers moved carefully at first, each press a battle between fear and courage. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes watching her, waiting, wondering. Her chest tightened, her stomach twisted. But she closed her eyes and let the music guide her hands. Slowly, the shaky sound began to settle. Her fingers remembering the countless nights of practice, the cardboard keys, the empty hall where she had poured her heart into every note. The melody grew smoother, fuller, her small body swaying gently with the rhythm. The whispers in the crowd faded into silence. The parents, the students, the teachers, all leaning forward without even realizing it. No one expected this from her. The girl they had only seen waiting quietly on benches while her mother worked late. The piano sang under her touch, clumsy in some places, but alive in every way that mattered. Her mistakes didn't break the music. They made it human, raw, something that reached the hearts of those listening. Each note carried not just sound, but story. The long evenings in cold hallways, the silent practice at home, the longing in her chest that never gave up. It wasn't polished like the other students. It wasn't trained, but it was real. Her mother sat in the back, clutching her hands together, her eyes wide with tears. She had always known her daughter carried something inside her. But hearing it now, seeing the whole hall stilled by the sound, it was almost too much for her heart to hold. She pressed her hand against her lips to keep from crying out, her chest shaking with pride. The teacher stood near the side of the stage, his arms crossed, his eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. He had seen many performances, students with years of training, but none had played with this kind of soul. He knew this moment was not just music, it was truth. The girl leaned closer to the keys, the notes flowing faster now, her hands moving as if they were no longer afraid. The hall seemed to disappear. The faces vanished, the lights faded. It was only her and the piano, a conversation between heart and sound. She was no longer the cleaner's daughter in that moment. She was a musician, and the piano was her voice. As she reached the final part, her fingers trembled again, but this time with something new. Not fear, but release. The last notes rose high, echoing through the air, filling every corner of the hall. Then, with one final touch, the music ended, the sound fading slowly into silence. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Only silence so deep it made her breath catch. Her hands rested on the keys, her eyes still closed, her body frozen in the echo of the last note. She opened her eyes slowly, and for the first time, she looked at the crowd. The hall erupted. Applause burst like a wave. People stood from there, seats, clapping, cheering, some even wiping their eyes. The sound overwhelmed her, louder than the music itself. Her chest ached, her eyes filled with tears. She had expected whispers and laughter, but instead she saw faces shining with awe, with pride, with respect. She rose from the stool slowly, her legs weak, her hands shaking, but the applause did not stop. Parents looked at her as if they were seeing her for the first time. Students who had never spoken to her stared with wide eyes. The teacher nodded at her, a small smile on his face, as if to say, "You see, you belong." Her mother stood too, clapping harder than anyone, her face wet with tears she could no longer hide. In that moment, she didn't feel like a cleaner. She felt like the proudest mother in the world. Her daughter had done what seemed impossible. She had turned silence into music, invisibility into light. The girl stepped down from the stage, her heart still racing, the applause echoing in her ears. She wanted to run, to hide, but everywhere she turned, people smiled at her, nodding, whispering in amazement. Some said they could not believe what they had heard. Others said they had never seen someone play with so much heart. The words washed over her, strange and wonderful. As she reached the side of the stage, her mother rushed to her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "You did it," her mother whispered, her voice breaking. "You truly did it." The girl clung to her, tears slipping down her cheeks. But they were not tears of fear anymore. They were tears of joy, of release. The applause still thundered in the hall, but for her, it was quiet now. All she could hear was the sound of her mother's heartbeat. All she could feel was the warmth of her arms. For the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, she was more than what the world expected her to be. And while the crowd still clapped, while the teacher still smiled, while the piano still gleamed on stage, the girl knew something had changed forever. She was no longer invisible, no longer just waiting on the sidelines. She had been heard, and nothing could take that away. The aftermath, the applause faded slowly that night, but its echo stayed in the girl's heart long after she left the stage. She walked home with her mother under the soft glow of the streetlights, the cold air brushing against their faces. Her small hand was tucked inside her mother's rough one, and neither of them spoke at first. They were both quiet, both lost in the memory of what had just happened. Finally, the mother squeezed her daughter's hand gently. "You see," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I told you. The music was always inside you." The girl looked up, her eyes wide, her lips curved into a small smile. She didn't have words big enough to explain what she felt. All she knew was that tonight, she was no longer just the quiet girl waiting in the corner. She had become someone who was heard. At school the next day, everything felt different. Students who had never noticed her before now stopped in the hallway to look at her. Some whispering in amazement, others smiling shyly. Teachers nodded at her with respect. Even the principal called her name with pride. The girl who had once blended into the background now carried a presence she never imagined. The music teacher placed a hand on her shoulder that afternoon and said softly, "That was only the beginning." She nodded, her cheeks warm, her heart swelling, because deep down she knew he was right. For the first time, she felt that maybe her dream could grow beyond the walls of the school. But life did not suddenly become easy. Her mother still rose before dawn, cleaning rooms until her hands ached. Their home was still small, their meals still simple. Yet something had shifted. A spark had been lit. And that spark brought light. Even into the hardest days, the girl practiced more, sometimes on the school piano, sometimes only in her mind at night, tracing invisible keys against the blanket. The difference now was that she no longer practiced in silence. People were beginning to listen. Weeks later, a letter came from the school office. It was an invitation for the girl to audition for a youth program in the nearby city, a program that gave lessons to talented children who could not afford them. Her mother held the letter with trembling hands, tears slipping down her cheeks as she read the words aloud. Her daughter's eyes lit with wonder, her heart pounding with excitement and fear. Could this truly be real? Could the world actually be opening a door for her? The day of the audition, she and her mother traveled by bus, the city buildings towering above them, the streets filled with sounds and faces they had never known. The girl clutched her sheet of music tightly, her hands shaking when it was her turn. She sat at the piano, her chest heavy, her breath short, but then she remembered the showcase. The silence before the applause, the voice of her mother saying, "Play for yourself," and once again, she closed her eyes and let the music speak. When she finished, the judges looked at her with quiet surprise, then nodded to each other. By the time she left the room, her mother was already waiting, her eyes searching her daughter's face. The girl smiled softly and whispered, "I think they liked it." Her mother pulled her close, her heart bursting with pride. Weeks later, the acceptance letter arrived. She had been given a scholarship, a chance to learn from real teachers, a chance to grow. The mother pressed the letter to her chest. Her tears falling freely, she whispered, "This is your path now." The girl hugged her tightly, whispering back, "It's our path, from then on." Life carried a different rhythm. The mother still worked, the cleaning still continued, but now there was music at the end of every day. The girl traveled to lessons, carrying with her the memory of cardboard keys, empty hallways, and the first trembling note she ever played in secret. She never forgot where it began, never forgot the quiet nights when the piano seemed like an impossible dream. The years ahead were uncertain. There would still be struggles, still be challenges. But the girl had found her voice, and once a voice is heard, it cannot be silenced. She grew, she learned, and each step forward was not just hers, it was her. Mothers too, because every note she played carried the strength of the woman who never gave up, who worked until her hands ached, who believed quietly even when the world didn't. One evening after practice, the girl sat at the piano in their small home, a second-hand instrument gifted by donors who had heard her story. Her mother sat by the window, her tired hands folded in her lap, listening. The girl's fingers moved across the keys, her body swaying with the music, her face glowing with joy. When the final note faded, she turned to her mother and whispered, "One day, Mama, I'll play on the biggest stage, and you'll sit in the front row." Her mother smiled through her tears, her voice soft but steady. "You already played on the biggest stage, the night you showed the world who you are." The girl laughed gently, wiping her own tears, and began to play again. The music filled the room, simple and true, carrying their story in every note. And though the world outside rushed on, in that small home, mother and daughter sat together, hearts full, knowing that their journey had only just begun.